Boris. Nama Om Vishnu. Krishna Vastai Bhutale Shri Bhakti Vedanta Swam Namane. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pachaline. Nivasishya Sindhari Pashtatada Satadade. Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda. Shri Advaita Gadadha Shiva Sadi Gaura Bhakti. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Okay, I think today we'll go without the pictures or the PowerPoint, because the PowerPoint itself. Now we're coming to the end of the slides that I've got for that, because you remember that's a separate study I did on the presentation for making friends with the mind. So just for today, until I write up some notes, to kind of go about. But then they're not extensive notes on the slides anyway. They're just indicators, right? So anyone, yeah. So let's go then. 229. So Sahachari, as you, she did have her hand up. She has a hand up. Yeah. Can read from.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's that's it.
Okay. Thank you. Having established a Praman, let us return to our dissertation on the false ego. When the pure state of the Mahatattva, Vasudeva, is further agitated by time, the three modes of nature become active, and their first effect is the false ego, Ahankara. Thus, the false ego is invested with three kinds of power: good, passionate, and ignorant, all expressed as serene, active, and dull. And it is from these three forms of false ego that all subsequent creation, subtle and gross, takes place. The predominating deity of this false ego is Lord Sankarshan, and it is by his grace that one is again freed from the grasp of false misconceptions, Ahankara. To re-emphasize and in summary, when in the Mahatattva, the modes of material nature become activated by the influence of time, then false ego manifests in the living entity. Because the active Mahatattva means creation, because creation means bodies, and because bodies means instruments of misidentification. It is at this stage that the living entity again consciously turns away from Krishna and enters the material atmosphere. In the Lord Kapila's words, divided into varieties by her threefold modes, material nature creates the forms of the living entities, and the living entities, seeing this, are illusioned by the knowledge covering feature of the illusionary energy. Because of his forgetfulness, the transcendental living entity accepts the influence of material energy as his field of activities, and thus actuated by, he wrongly applies the activities to himself. Whatever exists is a transformation of false ego. Thus, in one sense, false ego is all-pervading, which explains why it is so difficult to attain liberation from it. For example, false ego manifests as the doer in the form of the demigods, as the instrument in the form of the senses, and as the combination of doer and instrument in the form of material objects. While false ego manifests everything created, it continues to remain as the cause, the subtlest aspect of the material energy. The juncture between matter and spirit, like the air, false ego pervades all created beings and induce two kinds of thinking, ahanta and mamata. I am this body, and everything related to this body is mine. There are the two weapons in the aforementioned analogy of the chariot. In chapter 4, we have described the purification and the spiritualization of these two aspects of ego. Further attributes evolving from these states of mind are lust for more, greed for what is not needed, anger at loss, fear of loss, especially from death, happiness, and distress arising from these, and so on. In reality, all thinking behind conduct that is not in pursuance of pure devotional service, even if it is under other Vedic injunctions, it is caused by false ego and results in desire and further bondage.
Perhaps we better pause there.
While we have previously explained how in different...
Hare Krishna, we just press the pause there. Select guy in. Yeah. This is quite technical, but in essence, the seed or everything begins from misidentification or false ego. And that is the source of creation. I think that's what Maharaj is saying. Yeah. Everything is a manifestation of false ego. And then when this false ego comes in touch with the manifested, say, modes of material nature, it sets creation. It sets in motion the whole of creation. Yeah. So misidentification. Yeah. Raj mentioned earlier that the soul itself can never be contaminated, but it's the misconception of the self which causes bondage. Is that okay for any questions on that? I think that's, I was reading through this earlier, and as far as I could understand, this is the essence of what Maharaj is saying here. That's why it's so difficult to overcome. And in the layers of the universe, each universe is covered in different layers, as we read in Srimad Bhagavatam. And the biggest one is, you guessed it, it's the false ego. Now, what that looks like, I was always curious what that layer of false ego looks like. Is it? It's a subtle, because the false ego is a subtle. It's a statement of the subtle misconceptions in the mind, but it's considered a covering of the universe. So, does it look like anything, or what is it? Is also a bit of a mystery. But nevertheless, that's why Prabhupada would always prod us on this point. He would always prod us on what point would he always say? Practically every lecture you can hear Prabhupada was saying, I mentioned 5 words. When I say it, you will say, oh yeah, we are not these bodies.
Spirit soul, yes.
We are spirit soul. He's directly prodding the false ego, because we think we are these bodies. And then also, an addition to that, once you think like that, or once you make that one wrong equation, everything else is then wrong. Everything that you base your identity on is wrong. For instance, if you start off with a calculation that 1 + 1 = 3, then all of your calculations from that point will be incorrect. Although we do have to function to some degree on the basis of false ego. For instance, you have to function like your grandmother. I'm looking at some of your grandmother. You have to function like that. You can't say your grandchildren, no, I'm not your grandmother. I'm a husband, I'm a wife, or I'm a brahmana, I'm a chatru. Whatever, it's all wrong from an absolute perspective, but we have to take on those roles in order to function within Varna and Ashram. Yeah. But we should understand that ultimately, as Lord Chaitanya said, I'm not a Brahmin, not Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra, Brahmachari, Grihastha, Vanaprasthas, or a Sannyasi. I identify myself only as the servant of Krishna, the master of the gopis. He is the cause of universal bliss, and is always existing with brilliance. So it's that false, that first it started with, Maharaj was quoting Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur with remember we described about being indifferent to the Lord, being indifferent or apathetic to his service. So then we grasp hold of, grasp hold of matter and false identification with matter, so false ego. Well, even people in outside of Krishna consciousness have heard of false ego, isn't it? We heard of false ego. They have different conceptions of what that is. They must have, yeah. But false ego, false sense of the self. And if there's other questions on that, we can.
What about true ego? If the true ego says, I am this body, does it becomes false ego then, straight away?
If the true ego?
Yes. True ego is the self, the spirit, soul, the spiritual side of the ego.
Yeah, I mean, our real ego, actually, if we really, well, that's mistaken. And if we think we're this body, we're something much more better than this body. It's such a sad, such a say diabolical, sad conclusion to consider we are this temporary bag of straw. We are something much better than that. We are the eternal servants of Krishna. Don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, that would be wrong. Yeah, that wouldn't be a true, yeah. I guess we'll only be free from false egos when we really know who we are.
And that becomes a true big ego then.
Yeah, that's a true ego. Yeah, like if Madhu Mongol, he says he's a Brahmana, that's not his false ego. If Radharani says she's a cowherd girl, that's not false ego. If Krishna says he's the son of Nanda Maharaj, that's not false ego. But if we say, I'm the son of my parents, that's false ego. That's false. It's just a temporary, something we've just happened to, in this one particular life, we just happen to identify with. And the next life, we'll identify with another body, if we're unfortunate enough to get another material body. Actually, we will get another, even if we reach perfection, then, as you know, we will take birth in Brahma Vrindavan. So we will be in another womb again. But hopefully it'll be in the gopis' womb. When we get born in a village where Krishna is performing his pastimes. Yeah. And we are going to have to enter another womb, even if you reach perfection. But hopefully it's going to be in a womb, in a gopi womb. All right, should you read a bit more? Chandravali, you like to read?
Yeah.
Just have one page each today, 2 pages.
Where were we?
Oh.
231.
Sorry?
231 on the top.
Yeah, at the top, right?
231.
While we have previously explained how indifference to spiritual practice is inherent in the mind due to its misuse of independence. Now, after elaborating on the manifestation and behavior of the false ego, we can see how that indifference is further compounded by an equal ingrained attachment to self and to acquired belongings. Since Karma Yoga and Gyan Yoga focus on the effect of both indifference and false ego and not on their cause, those forms of yoga are unable to deliver the conditioned soul from bondage. Only pure bhakti cleanses the consciousness of the jiva and revives its desire to survive. This is confirmed in Serve.
Yeah.
This is confirmed in Sanat Kumar's advice to King Prithu. The devotees who are always engaged in the service of the toes of the lotus feet of the Lord can very easily overcome hard-knotted desires for fruitive activities. Because this is very difficult, the non-devotees, the Gyanis and Yogis, although trying to stop the waves of sense gratification, cannot do so. Therefore, you are advised to engage in devotional service of Krishna, the son of Vasudeva. In the previously mention Srimad Bhagavatam analogy involving the mind and the chariot. The consciousness was the impetus for movement. And we have mentioned that consciousness is the sense of awareness. The senses have their individual function, which means they are empowered with a certain kind of awareness, seeing, hearing, and so on. By sensory awareness, the living entity connects with sense objects and thus charts a path through the jungle of sense gratification, objects, and experiences. In that way, consciousness becomes the impetus for the movement of the living entity. However, that consciousness becomes contaminated by many base qualities sprouting from the sense of I and mine. And it is that contaminated consciousness and its role in the life of conditioned soul that is worthy of brief attention. However, before proceeding further, a fine point should be clarified in our definition of consciousness being identified as awareness. And that point is, Srila Prabhupada at times equates contaminated consciousness with false ego, which in fact is more than awareness. It is the awareness of something. So why in this book have we chosen the former definition? The reason is that at other times, Srila Prabhupada and scriptures also define consciousness as awareness that make a distinction between contaminated consciousness and false ego. And they also define the sequence in which the two appear. Let us look at an example of these quotes and their resolution. In his commentary to the following verse, which clearly differentiates contaminated consciousness from false ego, Srila Prabhupada equates the two. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having four aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. The following is the entire purport to the verse. The four internal senses or subtle senses described herein are defined by different characteristics. When pure consciousness is polluted by material contamination, and when identification with the body becomes prominent, one is said to be situated under false ego. Consciousness is function of the soul, and therefore, behind consciousness, there is soul. Consciousness polluted by material contamination is called ahankar.
Okay,
In the world,
perhaps we just pause there. Just do 2 pages and pause. So I'm just making a distinction now between, quite detailed distinction here, between consciousness and false ego. Sometimes Prabhupada will speak of the two as being the same, but also he speaks of a distinction between the two. So at the end, Maharaj is quoting here, behind consciousness, consciousness polluted by material contamination is called ahankara, so false ego. Any other question? This is a nice verse. I learned this verse a few years ago, and I forgot it a few years ago as well, but just seeing it again, I want to try and learn it again. Pada pankajaya palasavlasa bhakta kamasu gratitam uddakana samvatam vannirikto yatayo diruda shitogunatam aranam bhadra vasudevam. This is one of my favorite conversations in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Is Sanat Kumar speaking to Maharaj Prithu. Yeah, the four Kumaras. And wonderful instructions that he receives from the 4 Kumaras. And one of those instructions I remember now, it's like just like a river which has big, strong reeds on the banks, then what often happens is that the reeds on the banks, they take out all the water. So it's just dry, a dry riverbed, because all the reeds have sucked out the water. So he describes similarly, by meditating on the objects of the senses, it sucks out all of our Krishna consciousness. It's this dry bed. It's quite very it's an interesting meditation. But by taking shelter of Krishna's lotus feet, so that is the cure for everything that we are reading about ultimately. It's difficult if we're over influenced by false ego, etc., and contaminated consciousness, it makes it all the more difficult. So at least hearing about it, we get a chance to loosen the knot. You know, the knot's quite tight, but by chanting, engaging devotional service, studying the mess that we're in, we can untighten that knot. I mean, those who dress deities, they have to, you know, who's dressed, a few of you might dress deities, dressing deities, but pujaris become expert at undoing knots. One of the trades you pick up is because the previous pujari ties it in a knot, you know, then you come to take that dress off and it's like a Gordian knot. You have to struggle with it. Sometimes you have to cut it. It's just too far gone. You know, it's too far gone, and you're spending 5 minutes trying to undo the knot. So you have to cut it. So that cutting is directly, you could say, chanting the holy name. Yes. Right, let's have, if there's some questions out there or comments, we can have Anupama. You'd like to read from 233. If I got that right? 233. And, yes, sorry.
I just wanted to understand this bit a little bit more. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of a mind, intelligence, ego, contaminated.
Where are you reading from? Oh yeah, I got it. Yeah,
232. I just wanted to understand that the internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects. So in the shape of a mind, intelligence, ego, contaminated consciousness. So I was like thinking about, some kind of an example.
All right, let's try and break this down.
Yeah, I was trying to break. Is it something like you see an object? I'm just thinking to myself.
Let's begin with, what's the internal subtle senses? Anyone can tell us what the internal subtle senses are?
Is that like the mind?
Mind, so the mind, so desire. So the internal subtle senses.
The mind and intelligence are internal and their senses, are they?
Yeah, the mind, intelligence, and false ego. Yeah, let's see. I think that's
You see, it doesn't say false ego, so it says subtle senses, so it says ego, right? So is this, you know, when we purify our mind, intelligent ego, you know, by doing devotional service, that's going to be, then that's.
Yeah, I think Marge spoke about this earlier, that the internal subtle senses, when they interact with the different aspects, that one or those subtle senses will then function differently according to what they interact with. Yeah, so that's why it says, so distinctions can be made by different functions. So the mind is different. So the mind with intelligence and the ego and contaminated consciousness. So the internal senses, they then externally, so to speak, will manifest as these four.
Yeah, that's
Mind,
what
intelligence, ego, and contaminated. So contaminated consciousness is, yeah, contaminated consciousness.
that's the only one I couldn't quite figure, because as this, when you, by performing devotional service, you will change your subtle senses like the mind, intelligence. It's not false ego, right? So then I couldn't figure out contaminated consciousness. I couldn't get that into the other three.
Well, unless anyone has any ideas, but contaminated consciousness is what we are dealing with.
Yeah.
So that's material consciousness as opposed to Krishna consciousness. Yeah, like Veto Darpanam Marjanam, is that's the whole process, is to cleanse the mirror of the mind. So kind of we look through a dirty mirror. Like I just cleaned my glasses just now because they were contaminated, so I couldn't see properly. Then when I clean them with this stuff, not the holy name, then I can see more better. So yeah, the more we become Krishna conscious, the more we can see things that are in the right perspective. Otherwise, if our consciousness is contaminated, everything we see will also be wrong. We will make, we fundamental, if the fundamental aspect of if our subtle fundamental aspect of ourselves, our consciousness is contaminated, we will then think wrong. Like if you say like a young man identifies, he has his contaminated consciousness, so he identifies with the body. So then he's attracted to the opposite sex or vice versa because of contaminated consciousness. Someone who's got clear consciousness, they're not attracted to bodies. They're attracted to Krishna, or they see bodies for what they are and actually not very attractive.
Yeah, it makes sense because the sentence underneath it says distinction between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics, So like you say, you see it differently with the contaminated.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Right,
Sorry.
No problem. I think Anupama upstairs waiting. Anupama, excuse me, that's the correct way to.
Okay. Shall I start?
Yeah, 233, I think, at the top.
Yeah, 233, yeah. In the verse, Kapila Dev lists ego and contaminated consciousness as separate features of the Anta-Atmakam, the internal subtle senses. And in the beginning of his purport, Srila Prabhupada acknowledges that listing and then summarizes how both come into being. However, in the last line of the purport, Sri Prabhupada clearly identifies contaminated consciousness as false ego. Consciousness polluted by material contamination is called ahankara. We have what seems to be a contradiction in the same purport. Sri Prabhupada states both things, but in two other purports, Sri Prabhupada clearly differentiates between false ego and contaminated consciousness. The appearance of consciousness after the appearance of false ego. And the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, false ego, and contaminated consciousness. What is the resolution of Srila Prabhupada's seemingly contradictory statements? The answer lies in Lord Kapila's words, Beho, Vrita, Lakshana, Rupya. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions since they represent different characteristics. Since both contaminated consciousness and false ego are part of the internal subtle senses, in one way they are the same. However, in another way, when viewed from their functions and characteristics, they are different. Thus, Srila Prabhupada's different statements simply represent different contexts in which these two features of the subtle body are mentioned. Therefore, returning to our definitions of consciousness and false ego from the viewpoint of functions and characteristics, consciousness is awareness itself. False ego is awareness of the body as the self, and contaminated consciousness is false awareness covering the soul infected by false ego. Continuing our study of contaminated consciousness, it is interesting to note that in other Srimad Bhagavatam's verse, Srila Prabhupada's translation of the word Chittena is along with reason. This is quite understandable as consciousness activates the reasoning faculty within the intelligence and to a lesser extent within the mind. Consciousness is a symptom of the soul, and consciousness activates both the subtle and gross bodies with its powers. Krishna says, Kshetram Kshetri Tata Shittanam Prashyantit. The living entity, one within the body, illuminates the entire body with consciousness. Therefore, where the soul is present, consciousness is found. When the soul appears in the Mahatattva with the contaminated intent of being the enjoy instead of the enjoyed, then its consciousness becomes equally contaminated. That contamination is caused by identification with the active modes of material nature and thus manifests and is manifested through a variety of bodies. The modes of nature are three in number, while their combinations are practically without limit. Thus, the different conditions of these modes facilitate different bodies, and they in turn reflect variety in contaminated consciousness. Lord Kapila says, as fire is exhibited in different forms of wood, so under different conditions of the modes of material nature, the pure spirit soul manifests itself in different bodies.
Okay, can just pause there, Mother. Can just pause there. Okay, a bit more there is being described. Something just came to mind then, I forget now.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, I was thinking, so I was just thinking of something, and then I just forgot then. Yeah, so yeah, contaminated consciousness. So yeah, that's it. If we have something which is, say you have, let's say you have something which is not in its correct working order, and it's not going to function. It just isn't going to function correctly. Just like I'm sure you'd experience. I'm sure you've all got a factual experience of our internet doesn't always work, so you can't always watch the class. You can't always hear the kids, and you can't always watch the class. Same about, we have this. Now we have, instead of an old blackboard. Anyone? Do you remember blackboards? We used to have a blackboard, old-fashioned blackboard. So that's a. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Now we have this big fancy projector, but about 4 or 5 days it wasn't working. So we was all, of course, we had our gadgets, so we could get the verses there. So if it's faulty, it doesn't work properly and it cannot function. So if we are to one degree or another in contaminated consciousness, so we can't function properly. We can't interact with the world how we should interact. We are not functioning properly. We are malfunctioning because we had false identification. Or no, for the consciousness is contaminated. Yeah, like does anyone like to eat contaminated food?
No.
We don't. No. So if we see a little bit of green on something, you go to eat something, you ever done that? You go to eat something, and just before you eat it, you see a green mold. Oh, nearly at that. It's good. And water, you may have gone to drink water. Yeah, the other day I was in the Bajaj department and I was really thirsty, and I saw this what looked like pineapple juice, Maha pineapple. So I grabbed it, and as I was tipping up, I realized I could smell it. It was ghee.
Oh
It was
no.
ghee. But lucky enough, I managed to smell it. My nose caught it before it hit my mouth, and I nearly drank ghee.
Mm.
So yeah, so being so so think of the word contaminated. So our consciousness is contaminated. So it's quite a bad thing to be contaminated, because that's a basic principle of looking at the whole of existence, and everything around us is based on looking through our consciousness. And if our consciousness is contaminated, then, as Father would often say, like that someone who's a lusty person will always see objects of his senses everywhere. That's their consciousness. Or if someone is a thief, they'll always be looking, they'll always be fearful of police and always looking at how to do some thievery. That's their consciousness. Yeah, if someone is like Prabhupada was Krishna conscious. So that's why all his disciples were really interested in how did Prabhupada perceive the world? What does Prabhupada think? How does Prabhupada perceive the world? Because that's the correct perception. Our perception is wrong because our consciousness is contaminated. He's got pure consciousness. Therefore, we can ask Prabhupada, what is this? What is that, Prabhupada? What is this? What is this? And he will tell us from the perspective of pure consciousness. And that's Prabhupada's purpose. Prabhupada's purpose is how someone in pure consciousness thinks, feels, and wills, how they was the very inner thinking of a pure soul. That's Prabhupada's purpose and how he sees the world. So that's why our job is to clean the consciousness. That's what we're trying to do all day. Hare Krishna. And I just caught my mind just that word contaminated consciousness. So we're living with contaminated consciousness to one degree or another. Of course, we're devotees. So we're trying our best to be in good, clear consciousness. Let me just, someone needs to mute there. Found it, managed to shoot it down. I have to press mute from my side here. Again, it's like playing a game or something. Okay, Hare Krishna. So let's perhaps another reader out there. Perhaps what paper on 235? Yeah, perhaps I'll have a go at reading. There's no hands up. Perhaps someone else next. 235, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
While in its pure state, the living entity's consciousness spiritually enlivens the ego, okay, mind, intelligence, and body. So it kind of has this electronic effect. Yeah. In the pure state, it affects the mind, intelligence, everything becomes spiritualized. But when that same pure consciousness becomes adulterated by the effects of the modes of nature, the bewildered soul embraces many kinds of false ego, with which are connected many kinds of bodies, subtle and gross, displaying a spectrum of contaminated consciousness. Therefore, we have 8,400,000 different species of contaminated consciousness to actually choose from.
Can I say something quickly? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
This is good. You read the paragraph because this is quite a lot to take. It's good. You was reading sentence and then the paragraph, and then you was going with a couple of points. I think that would be
Yeah,
Using-
it helps me to understand it, at least.
Yeah, because when we read 2 pages, then, you know, you're going back to what you're thinking. It's like, this is good. If you're reading and you're explaining as you're going along, would be better for now.
Okay.
Is that okay? Would you?
Yeah, we can. Well, actually, we'll just nearly finish this chapter, actually, and then.
Okay.
Yeah. And the next chapter is more detailed than this one. Get ready. It's called the Shankhya of Sankalpa.
Okay.
Yeah, we can try that for now. For a conditioned soul, both bondage and liberation are difficult to conceive of. Just as a person absorbed in a dream has little understanding of either the illusion of dreaming or the reality of being awake. I can't comment much of that, don't understand it.
No, that's...
Let me try again. For a conditioned soul, both bondage and liberation are difficult to conceive of. Just as a person absorbed in dream has little understanding either the illusion of dreaming, yeah, okay, or the reality of being awake. Yeah, they're so immersed in it that they have no objective criteria to actually judge anything on. They're enclosed in it, so they can't look at it from outside. They don't have that ability. Yeah.
Like, I'm just thinking, like the conditioned soul, but bondage of liberation, it's not, they can't conceive it, you know, because they're conditioned.
Yeah. Just like if you was to stop someone in the street, you know, if say there's people sitting outside a pub, and can I ask you a question? Can you describe to me about the bondage that you are in? You what? Or can you describe to me about liberation? What's your idea of moksha? It's like asking a dog. It's like asking a dog who's going to win the next election. Or asking a goldfish what's going to be the weather tomorrow. It's not relevant question. So the conditioned soul is they're so far out of touch.
See, and then in the same point, Maharaj is explaining that in a dreaming state, you wouldn't understand illusion or dreaming quality, you know, or so it's, that paragraph makes sense then, you know.
Yeah, but sometimes as devotees, or sometimes everyone had the experience where you're aware you're dreaming. In the dream, you're aware that you're dreaming, and then you kind of make functions to move outside of that. Sometimes that can happen. Yeah, I was also appreciating. I mean, this. Can you imagine what type of study Maharaj has done to actually write this book? It's phenomenal. I mean, who is it? Any of us could actually do this level of study? It's like something phenomenal what Maharaj has done. The way he's analyzed it, and and explaining it, and looked at all purpose books and purpose. It's like, we're so fortunate that because would we on our own efforts come to these same conclusions which are given here? Perhaps not.
Just shows what consciousness he's at, I mean,
yeah.
It's just unthinkable for me anyways, unthinkable.
Yeah. Srimad Bhagavatam repeatedly likens contaminated consciousness, its perception of the material world, and its absorption in sense gratification, to be the experience of a person engrossed in a dream. Yeah, so it's not reality. Prabhupada calls it the daydream and the night dream, isn't it? At nighttime, we're dreaming and we're in some misconception of ourselves. Then we wake up. It's another big misconception. Daydream, night dream, Prabhupada calls it. Such a contaminated state, while real, is temporary, and like a dream, it is but the product of the material mind. Liberation means to awaken from the dream, and waking up is the call by which the Vedic literature addresses humans. Bhaktivinoda Thakur sings, Jeev Jago, Jeev Jago, Gora Chanda Bole, Kota Nidra Jaya Maya, Pisachiya Kole. It's really beautiful. On the Navadvip Paragram, I've been a few times. The camp, it stays, you know, in the morning at sunset, everyone sets off because we camp overnight, and at sunset, while the fog is still there, going over the thatched hutches, and Rajkishore's nodding his head, you know. Then it starts off, and the bhajan they start singing as we leave in the morning is Jeev Jago, Jeev Jago, Tora Chanda Bole. So nice. Wake up, sleeping soul. Wake up, sleeping soul. Lord Chaitanya is calling. How long will you sleep in a lap of Maya? The answer to Lord Chaitanya's question is that the living entity continues to dream as long as it voluntarily embraces the illusory potency of the Lord. So that voluntary means we are choosing to do it. Maya doesn't have hold of us. We have hold of Maya. Does anyone know that story that's told in that regard of one king?
Tree.
Yeah, the tree. Remember, he asked the Brahmana, what is Maya? So the next day, the Brahmana was holding the tree saying, let go, let go. Saying, yeah, this is Maya. Yeah. So as much as we volunteer, it sounds easy said and done. If we voluntarily grab hold of Maya, we should be voluntarily be able to let go of Maya. But again, because we're so lost in it, it's sometimes difficult to actually do that. Yeah. So, which convinces the jiva that dreaming is both reality and natural. Lord Brahma admits to Krishna. Therefore, this entire universe, which is like a dream, is by natural unreal. Nevertheless, appears real, and thus it covers one's consciousness and assails one with repeated miseries. This universe appears real because it is manifested by the potency of the illusion emanating from you. As I said, Devi Esha Gunamayi, this divine energy of mine, consisting of the three modes of material nature. The universe appears real because it is manifested by the potency of illusion emanating from you, whose unlimited transcendental forms are full of eternal happiness and knowledge. A living entity begins the process of waking up when, by the acquisition of transcendental knowledge, that's what we're doing now, we're acquiring transcendental knowledge, it realizes its folly and takes up sadhana bhakti. And liberation, bhava bhakti, is the waking state. Srila Prabhupada comments on this verse, Mukti hitvanyata rupam shrarupena vayastati. Mukti means liberation from contaminated consciousness of this material world and becoming situated in pure consciousness. Prabhupada often quotes this verse to oppose the Mayavadis, whose concept of liberation is oneness. But here it means to become free from the gross and subtle bodies, situated in pure consciousness. King Rantidev is an example of a pure devotee who, being always fully Krishna conscious, was both free from material enchantment and entirely oblivious of Maya, in a way that the dream has no existence for one who is awake. To understand what is real and what is a dream, Narada Muni gives us a rule of thumb that he says is the secret of the Vedas. Adrishtam drishtavan nakshet, bhutam swapnavat anyata, bhutam bhavat bhavishyatcha, shuptam savarohoraha. Everything happening within time, which consists of past, present, and future, is merely a dream. That is the secret understanding of all Vedic literature. In the analogy of conditioned soul's life being akin to a dream, we must conclude that only in the liberated state, in which one is free of the modes of material nature, is consciousness again pure. And to the degree that one is under the modes of material nature, to that degree one's consciousness is contaminated, and one persists in a dream of illusion. Okay? So it's very difficult to shake off this illusion, isn't it? We may shake it off for a few minutes. Then again, why? Because we interact with the world, so we're interacting with the consequences of false ego. So we identify as parents, as whatever it is. We function that way. So that's why Nasta Preshu, constant hearing of these subjects will help to keep us, will help at least keep us steady and going in a right direction. You know, any questions or comments about this? We got. Yeah. I guess it's also one of those things, no matter how much we read about it, kind of almost, I can almost perceive some devotees. I can see some of your cameras on. Not all, some, but I can see it. So, yeah, but we know as soon as we close the book, and we're going to get entangled in the modes. But actually, if we're a bit retrospective, if we think retrospectively, we think back at the past and the things we were doing in the past. We actually made a lot of progress. You know, we made a lot of progress. We still have a ways to go. So, daydream, night dream. Let me just try and finish this one pager. Then we'll finish this chapter. Let's see. In that dream, sometimes one is a demigod, sometimes a spider. Okay. It all depends upon how deeply one is steeped in the illusion caused by the modes of nature. Sometimes we think we're like, I think I'm a brahmachari. I'm not. It's false ego. In any case, whether spider or Brahma or Krishna, as Krishna says, Manmaya Duradaya, it is difficult for anyone to overcome the material energy. The only way to do so is by surrendering to Krishna. It means you give up, you admit defeat. In his Jaiva Dharma, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur classifies a spectrum development of consciousness through which conditioned soul passes as being 5. Yeah, I had this as a slide, but anyway. These are consciousness that is covered, withdrawn, budding, blossoming, and blooming. The first 4 are degrees of contaminated consciousness. The 5th is pure consciousness. Souls in the body of plants have covered consciousness. Animals have withdrawn consciousness. Humans who are immortal and, immoral. Humans are immoral, who are immoral and atheistic have budding consciousness. Humans who are religious or practice sadhana bhakti have blossoming consciousness. And pure Vaishnavas who have attained Bhava Bhakti have blossomed consciousness.
We did that in Siddha Bhakti Chintamani a little bit.
Yeah, similar, isn't it?
Consciousness.
Keeping in mind that the consciousness in the chariot of the body directs the wayward soul, it is observed that the direction for plants is to grow, for animals to eat, sleep, mate, and defend, for sinful humans to behave like animals, for believers and sadhakas to make spiritual advancement, for Bhava Bhaktas to attain full-blown prema. The cultivation of the 4th state of consciousness, which Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls Mukulita Chaitana, is the theme of this book. A practicing devotee has Bhava as his goal of life, and in his cultivation of Krishna consciousness, he shuns anything that obstructs his attainment and embraces everything that qualifies him for it. Rupa Goswami explains that one takes to devotional service only because one has acquired qualification to strive towards Krishna in the previous life. For the rare devotees, such as Sankalpa may begin as early as the 7th month in the womb. That's described in 3rd canto, the fortunate soul prays in the womb. Yeah. Lord Kapila narrates how a spiritually blossoming embryo expresses its determination for perfection. That's one of the reasons to do Garbhodhan Samskara and other samskaras. Yeah. Therefore, without being agitated anymore, I shall deliver myself from the darkness of nescience with the help of my friend, clear consciousness. Simply by keeping the lotus feet of Vishnu in my mind, I shall be saved from entering into the wombs of many mothers for repeated births and deaths. When such a fortunate soul encounters a pure Vaishnava, his spiritual journey starts anew, and as the process of sadhana bhakti purifies his consciousness, his direction of life becomes clear, back to Godhead. Gradually, by systematic sadhana and progressive determination, such a devotee moves up the ladder of bhakti, his increasingly purified consciousness inspiring his mind and intelligence forward. In this way, by the causeless mercy of Vaishnavas and the Lord, such a devotee's false ego gradually dissolves, just as fog evaporates with the rising of the sun. He becomes self-realized, free from all doubts, and increasingly sheltered by the Hladini Shakti. And finally, the sadhaka crosses over the boundary of matter into the realm of spirit. All false egoistic conceptions disappear, and he realizes his eternal ego as Krishna's servant. Thus empowered, such a fortunate soul quickly achieves the ultimate goal of life, and with pure consciousness returns to the transcendental abode, never to return. Thus the subtle body of mind, intelligence, false ego, and contaminated consciousness, a result of abuse of free will, and the vehicle that carries a bewildered soul through countless bodies, is by the process of sadhana bhakti dissolved, as confirmed by Lord Kapila. Bhakti devotional service dissolves the subtle body of the living entity without separate effort, just as fire in the stomach digests all that we eat. Hare Krishna. That's up. Okay, we finished then chapter 13, and next week we're beginning this chapter, the Shankhya of Kapila. So let's see. Any final comments on that or questions? That was a bit of the end was a bit more hopeful for us, isn't it? Driving the positive results of actually cleansing the consciousness. Right. Hare Krishna. So, thank you. And tomorrow we have Tuesday. Which Tuesday we're doing? The questions, yeah, questions and answers, yeah. And Wednesday we can do as well, because then we leave for Muvaj Dham on Thursday morning. So we'll just miss Thursday morning, and then we'll miss next Monday and Tuesday, and we'll be back next Wednesday. I can remind you all on Wednesday about that. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I hope this reading was good and interesting into looking at the mess we're in, where to go. Krishna. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.
Chandravali Mother, shall I end the meeting or make someone else the host?
No, just end it.
Okay. We're going to go to our own little worlds. Hare Krishna. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hare Bol. Oh. Still the end. Hare Krishna.